Welcome to this episode of In Conversation on Wagner's Ring Cycle. Our star-studded guest panel today includes scholars of Wagner, his politics, theories, and creative process, as well as MOT's artistic director, Yuval Sharon, as practitioner. Dr. Gundula Kreuzer is a professor of music at Yale University. In both her writing and her teaching, Kreuzer approaches music from a wide range of interdisciplinary perspectives, such as social, cultural, and political history, as well as theories of technology and multimedia. Her award-winning first book, Verdi and the Germans, From Unification to the Third Reich, examines the changing impact of the popular Italian composer on German musical self-perception and national identity. Her second monograph, Curtain Gong Steam, Wagnerian Technologies of 19th Century Opera, addresses how composers since the late 18th century increasingly tried to control certain aspects of staging by embracing specific stage technologies. Dr. David Levine is the Addie Clark Harding Professor in Dramatic Studies, Cinema and Media Studies, and Chair of the Committee on Theater and Performance Studies at the University of Chicago, where he also serves as Senior Advisor to the Provost for Arts. Levine's work focuses on the aesthetic and politics of performance in opera, theater, and cinema. He is the editor of Opera Through Other Eyes and the author of Richard Wagner, Fritz Lang, and the Nibelungen, the dramaturgy of disavowal, and Unsettling Opera, staging Mozart, Verdi, Wagner, and Zemlinsky. He's also worked extensively as a dramaturg for various opera and ballet productions in Germany and the United States. Dr. Kirsten Page is a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University and received her PhD in music history from UC Berkeley in 2018. Page's work demonstrates how scientific knowledge reshaped musical practices and oral cultures in the 19th and 20th centuries. Her essays have appeared or are forthcoming in the Cambridge Opera Journal, the Opera Quarterly, the Journal of the Royal Musical Association, and the Journal of the American Musicological Society. Yuval Sharon is the newly appointed Gary L. Wasserman Artistic Director of Michigan Opera Theater. Described by the New York Times as opera's disruptor, Yuval has been creating an unconventional body of work which seeks to expand the operatic form. Yuval founded and serves as artistic director of The Industry in Los Angeles, a company devoted to new and experimental opera that has brought opera into moving vehicles, operating train stations, Hollywood sound stages, and various non-spaces such as warehouses, parking lots, and escalator corridors. His production of John Adams' Dr. Atomic received the 2014 Goetz Friedrich Prize in Germany. He produced the first fully staged opera ever presented at Vienna's Musikverein, and in 2018, Sharon became the first American director at the Bayreuth Festival with his production of Lohengrin. Sharon has been honored with a MacArthur Fellowship and a Foundation for Contemporary Art grant for theater. I am in awe of our distinguished guests today who come to the study of Wagner and the Ring Cycle from a broad range of topics and interests. So let's begin with each of you introducing an aspect of your research, whether that be Wagner's theories, his process of creating music dramas, or his worldviews, and how that topic relates specifically to the Ring. Could we start out with David Levine? Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, and what an honor to be here with this group and in dialogue with this really exciting work. So my work has been primarily organized and fascinated with the politics of staging, on how a work or a body of work can morph over time and indeed between interpreters. Wagner's works, of course, invited an extraordinary array of interpretations. And this fact in and of itself is fascinating, how many different accounts we have of, say, the Twilight of the Gods, a Marxist account, an abstract account, an autobiographical account, a pacifist account, a nationalist account, we could go on. And in this, it seems to me Wagner's like a great deal of really great dramatists, right? Sophocles, Euripides, Shakespeare, we can think of all kinds of different conjugations of the work. Ibsen, more recently, Suzanne Laurie Parks. But what makes Wagner even more fascinating, it seems to me, is the fact that his work as an interpreter and a critic involves the very same notion. That is, this notion that staging really matters, that art is and has to be urgently relevant, that it matters that we get it right and that we not get it wrong. So on the one hand, he creates this capacious body of work that is so complex and so rich and so inviting, open to such a vast array of interpretive possibilities. And yet he also creates an extraordinarily intense interpretive machine that raises the stakes and places extraordinary pressure on getting it right. So you have, on the one hand, a sense like you better get it right, and on the other hand, a sense that the world of interpretation is wildly open. And that seems like a really exciting opportunity. So to use one specific example, so an example that seems relevant to the production at hand, who or what is Grane, right? This horse. In some productions, it's inconsequential. In some productions, there is in fact a horse on stage. But for instance, in a Stuttgart production, a recent Stuttgart production by Peter Konvichny, Grane is a hobby horse, like a little wooden horse that a 5-year-old might have. And that's not done just as a joke, although I think the audience laughed when it first saw it. But in fact, it encapsulates something of Siegfried's childishness and his naivete, right? So he rides it with intense curiosity, intense concentration, and seriousness. In Detroit, Grane is a Mustang, which seems intensely inspired as an idea because it encapsulates this sense of power and movement and something fundamental to the place where we are. I think this notion of Wagner as open to interpretive possibility, but also demanding of us an interpretive imagination, that seems extraordinarily exciting.
Wow. Could we turn also to Gundula Kreuzer? Could you tell us about your scholarship in Wagner and the Ring?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is so exciting. Similar to David, I'm interested in the complexities of Wagner's oeuvre, and in a way, I was curious about the gap between his theories and his practice and the operas that he staged and the way he did stage them in his own time. His theories were so hugely influential, and we still cite them today. Many media scholars, media theorists, media practitioners cite them. The idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. And yet Wagner, the artworks that he mentions in their treatise are all the traditional forms of art. It's especially poetry, of course, music and painting, and then architecture and sculpture, and they already have a back seat. But in practice, the situation was very different, and what Wagner needed above all was stage technologies. And of course, the Ring cycle is the most difficult work, I would say, of the 19th century to produce on stage. And Wagner started writing it not even knowing whether it would be possible to stage this monstrous, enormously long opera. Think of dragons that are singing and fighting and rainbow bridges and singing nixies and all that stuff. So what he needed above all was the highest end technology of his time. And so there's a deep irony embedded in his work, which is that his Gesamtkunstwerk, in terms of the political commitments that he had, it was to be revolutionary. It was to help society get away from the alienation of early industrialization and lead it back to nature. And yet he was dependent on precisely those industrial technologies to produce the Ring that he denounced in his theories. And so that's what my starting point for my book, Wagnerian Technologies, where I argue that he uses a lot of and develops a lot of technologies that were already existing on the stage, but he pushes them to the next level, both to pull off the stage feats that he has to stage for the Ring, and at the same time to veil the fact that they are actually done by technology and not through nature. And so one of my favorite examples is the use of steam. Water vapor, literally water vapor had been used before Wagner a little bit, but just for isolated moments. And then in the ring cycle, of course, fogs and fires and clouds take unprecedented front seat in the staging of the drama. And so to pull that off, and what he used in Bayreuth was actual locomotive engines that would puff the steam on stage. And of course, that was the most visible signifier of industrialization, smokestacks, railway machines. So those are all the ironies. There are many other technologies that I've looked at that I'm interested in, where Wagner does this double thing of using the highest end technology to actually veil the fact that ultimately the Gesamtkunstwerk is technological.
Indeed, fantastic. Kirsten Page, could you tell us about your research and Wagner and the Ring?
Yeah, definitely. So there are many aspects of my research that really overlap with what David and Gundula have already described. My research is particularly invested in Wagner's engagement with the history of science, particularly the history of the environment and climate. He was so obsessed with nature in all of its forms. We've already discussed a little bit in David's segment about how Wagner was really invested in this return to nature as a means of sort of collapsing this alienation that was a part of industrial modernity, industrial capitalism. And the Ring is really invested in kind of staging these ideas. I'll speak a little bit less about the technologies because I know Gundula really has that covered for us, but something I've been really, really interested in recently is the idea of how Wagner's theories about nature, how the technologies, how his stories about nature kind of bleed into his treatment of real nature, like nature in real life. So when you go to Bayreuth to go and see the Ring for the first time in the 19th century, the ways in which Wagner curates an environmental experience for spectators, who are these modern spectators coming from cities, they're being sent into pastoral Germany to go and see this ring cycle that's all about going back to nature. So he's kind of redoubling what happens inside of the theater, outside of the theater. And I've been really, really interested in thinking about how he's curating this environmental experience for spectators that really mirrors his ideas about nature. There's been so much that I think you can find in that journey that hasn't really been written about before, because of course that pilgrimage was very, very famous in the 19th century, and even today it's still sort of seen as a pilgrimage if you go to Bayreuth. But what I've found is that Wagner was really invested in all of these nature practices personally for his own health, but also when it comes to going to Bayreuth, these nature practices that really bring modern sort of capitalist, industrialist people back to nature to make them sort of cleaner, more healthy people, but also sort of more culturally and socially pure.
Yuval, Sharon, let's hear from you. Give us some context.
Wow, those are all such amazing responses. And I will say, first of all, I actually don't have a field of research personally. I'm a director, so I'm a practitioner, but I have to say that I think a lot about how theoretical ideas through the act of production become material, become legible, and become something that an audience reads and is put in relation to. And so I've been very inspired by the work of the three of you in thinking about this particular project. So it's very meaningful for me to be on this call with the three of you. Kirsten, for exactly what you were describing in terms of the environmental ideas that the romantic Wagner might have had, the depiction of a kind of fake naturalism on stage in the 19th century, which in a parking garage would be an absurd idea, you know? So thinking about the abstraction that this parking garage offers is something I've been wondering, and how nature or the concreteness of the parking center, the material concrete, I should say, what that does for our experience of nature and the Rhine and rivers and gold. And the idea that this whole opera is fundamentally about this plundering of nature, and that nothing can get put back together until somehow nature is reconstituted. And is that even possible anymore in Götterdämmerung? So I've thought a lot about your work in that context. Gundula, in terms of your work, you know, technology is something that I think is what always drew me to Wagner, and that notion of the Gesamtkunstwerk as the connection between all of the different art forms, but then somehow taken to a whole nother level through technologies. And the idea that Bayreuth was so state of the art and pushed stage technologies forward for as long as it's been producing. And that is certainly a big part of this particular production, because the audience is going to be hearing this entire production on their FM radios. So it's actually an incredibly high-tech version of Götterdämmerung, that allows for a completely different experience of it. Naturally, we are doing that not just because it's exciting, but because we wanted to create as safe of an environment as possible for our audience to experience it. That's actually how it started. The prompt was really how to make a piece happen in COVID. And in many ways, the easiest way to do it is to make sure the audience never leaves their car. But the attraction of taking this idea and exploring Wagner through it is precisely along the lines of what you were saying about what technology does to help us bring this piece together. And there is also a lot of fog. So there is definitely I won't give it away yet, but there is definitely a scene that's attributed to that. And David, your work on something that has always really inspired me is the notion that opera is an unsettled art form, an art form that doesn't imply a sense of a kind of perfect harmony between all the different arts, but that the reality of all these arts coming together is highly unstable. And through that unstable relationship of all the arts, you create something really original and unique, and something that almost cannot be classified. And I think that that's inspired me throughout my career, just thinking about opera as something that does not fit in any one genre. I guess it's its own genre, but it doesn't really fit with any of the one or the other things. It's an interstitial art form in so many ways. And I feel like that's what we're exploring here as well with Twilight Gods, is a piece that is both environmental, an immersive experience, a sound experience. It's part installation, it's part live performance, it's part audio journey. It's half audiobook sometimes, it's all of these things mixed together. And so I will just say thank you all for your incredible work. And I am excited to be grappling with those ideas as we get to the finish line with this particular project.
So Yuval, if I can just jump in, because, so one of the things that I wonder about is whether you understand the kind of work that you're undertaking here as an interpretive engagement with Götterdämmerung, or is it to be understood first and foremost as a kind of intervention into the constraints of the moment, right? So that Götterdämmerung is kind of secondary to the need to create. Would you want, in some sense, the Wagnerians of the world to be sort of attending this and in some sense anticipating it as an intervention, an interpretive intervention? Or how do you understand the project?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and I'm not sure if I have a very clear answer, because in a way, when you create a work, you're working to bring the moment and the work together. And the response to that is not up to me, really. The response is going to be up to everyone who comes to see it. So, but I will say that I chose Götterdämmerung very purposefully, because I do feel it is the piece that fits this moment so perfectly. I really felt it was the story of Brunhilde, the strong woman who says this old world order no longer works, and the hero that we thought was the hero is actually trapped in an ideology that he is not even aware of. It's up to me to finally be the one to take the fire to my father's palace. I mean, that notion, this was not a long-standing idea that I had, pre-COVID, waiting for the right moment, but this really was a response to the moment. I feel like we're living in Götterdämmerung right now. And in many ways, that could be a very hopeful sentiment.
That is so, sadly in a way, but it's so inspiring, Yuval, to hear this, because we are all here grappling with the situation, right? We are all thrown into a suddenly changed world situation and everyday life situation that we're grappling with. And I totally agree with you that Götterdämmerung is such a perfect piece, and I also feel that piece of hope in the end. And I wonder whether there's other things that you and everyone on this amazing panel think can be relevant in the entire ring cycle for this contemporary moment, but also more generally for our culture. Like one thing that I feel is, and it's already come up in many of your responses and also in your conception of staging Götterdämmerung in the parking garage, is all the other media that we have now. The old question that has been posed since the early 20th century: had Wagner lived later than he did, would he have become a film director, right? That question was posed in the 1920s, and I think today the question is, would Wagner have created virtual reality experiences and spectacles? Or are the virtual reality spectacles the video games? I'm thinking of Skyrim, I'm thinking of Fortnite, the creation of Cosmos, right? They all create a cosmos in which then the audience or the player gets immersed, and they get to create their own character, but they have to deal with this new cosmos, but then also save the world somehow and beat the enemies. All these ideas in the ring cycle. And I wonder whether there's other moments, aspects of Wagner's work, or specifically the ring cycle.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I'll just make I'll put a short one out there, because obviously we're not doing all of Götterdämmerung. We're doing an hour's worth of Götterdämmerung. So it's a selection of scenes that I think tell one complete story within this larger cosmos of the cycle. And one of the things that I wanted to trace was this notion that by the time we get to Götterdämmerung, we have this new generation of characters that are being pre-programmed from forces beyond their control. So we have this incredible scene between Albrecht and Hagen, where we see Hagen as this loveless, bitter man who doesn't even realize that he is this product of of a former generation, his father, Albrecht. You know, and that sadness, I see that so much in our country now, is that somehow these generations of hatred or bigotry or all of these things, they come from somewhere. They are not biological. They are not sui generis. This is something that is being passed on from generation to generation. And Götterdämmerung tells us this has to stop now. But the only way for it to stop is a conflagration.
I was reading an article last week about the presidential campaign. It was estimated that $500 million were raised last month in the pursuit of the White House. And so certainly this opera talks about this whole idea of the industrial society. I'm sure there's a lot here that actually is happening right now that's very relevant to this opera, I would say. Or am I wrong? I don't know. David, what do you think?
Well, look, I think, there are any number of words that you can use and Wagner will pop up. I think corruption is, corruption of political authority, like Wagner's all about that. And yet, the fascinating thing, endlessly fascinating thing about Wagner is that he's also all about it autobiographically. Like he's at once revolutionary and completely reactionary. He's at once, would overthrow the system and yet is working the system, is gaming the system. So like, it's so fascinating because, this notion, as Gundula was reminding us, the interpretive camps, it's not like, there's a Wagnerian camp and then there is another camp that somehow, one is radical, the other is reactionary. It's like Wagner encompasses both, right? So there's a radical Wagner and a reactionary Wagner. And so, I guess I would say the fascinating thing about Wagner is just how forthcoming he is in all directions, a kind of equal opportunity, artistic authority, who gives us, sententious and quotable claims that go in completely contradictory directions.
Yeah, so I was thinking in terms of this going in all directions comment that David had just made, when it comes to Wagner's ideas about nature and about environment, he sort of, his thinking is so incredibly vast. It's so all-encompassing. And at the same time, so it can seem very universal, some of the claims that he's making. And that's, I think, something that's particularly interesting about Wagner, is that he can make these claims about humanity, about nature, about environment, that sound very, very much like he's speaking of everyone altogether. But at the same time, those claims, when he speaks about humanity or speaks about nature, they are these kinds of veiled, like quite exclusionary ideas. So something that Yuval had said about how, these sort of racialized concepts that we find in the ring, they have a past, and that's and sort of their future is something that we see today. Similarly with Wagner, the sort of racialized concepts that we that are so familiar to us about Wagner are sort of embedded into his ideas about nature that can seem quite universal.
Wagner was hailed by Thomas Mann as probably the greatest talent in the entire history of art. Yet his influence extends far beyond his own collected works, even beyond art for that matter. From your own experience and research, where have you been the most surprised to encounter Wagner's influence, or in what ways might we unknowingly encounter Wagner or his theories today? Do you want to start us, Kirsten, since we just had you want to keep going?
Yeah, I love this question. There's so many possible answers to it that I was thinking of last night when you sent them to us. One answer that came to mind was Wagner's his investment in the anti-animal cruelty movement, which is something that a lot of listeners might not be aware of. This came very late in his life. So in 1879, he published this anti-vivisection essay, and he was asked to do so by the head of the Dresden Anti-Animal Cruelty Society, and it was actually an essay that was circulated at Bayreuth at the Festspielhaus. So some of the earliest visitors who might have seen The Ring and Parsifal later might have also read this essay. And the essay was accompanied by a call to donate money to this Anti-Animal Cruelty Society and sign a petition. And Germany was actually one of the first parts of Europe to actually have anti-animal cruelty laws. And that's not to say Wagner was directly involved in the passing of those laws, but it was something he believe strongly in. And the essay is quite complicated, but one of the main claims is that to be an ethical, compassionate human being, you have to understand the consciousness of the animal as being similar to your own as a human. And again, as I had mentioned earlier, that seems like a quite universal idea today, but at the time, it was actually sort of a racialized idea because alongside anti-animal cruelty laws in Germany were also anti-Semitic laws that sort of banned kosher butchering. So there was a notion that that Jews might not think of animals the way that the sort of proper humans do. So it's actually quite exclusionary, even though it seems like a very common idea. But that essay was really embraced by anti-animal cruelty societies in Britain in particular, the sort of humanitarian Christian societies, and they sort of saw Wagner as their composer. Because they saw him as being against animal cruelty, which he was in the case of this essay. And in these columns that they wrote about Wagner, they would sort of cite moments from his operas that they saw as advocating against animal cruelty, and they would cite passages from the essay.
Gundula, tell us ways which we still encounter Wagner today. Any surprises?
I'm not sure about surprises. I think I already mentioned that Wagner really is the backdrop and the foundation for so many popular media today. And we tend to think of opera as being elite and Wagner the most elite of elite, even though there's another dialectic, of course, because he had conceived of his Gesamtkunstwerk as being completely democratic. In fact, he calls it also the communal or the united work of art. So he really wants to unite society. And his original idea was to have it free for everybody, so that everybody could come and, of course, be educated there. And then that was ultimately a national idea to foster the national community. But this idea that art should be free and available to everybody. And so maybe it's not so ironic that actually many of his theories, but also his work itself, especially the Ring Cycle, the epic idea of having sequels to a story or having to tell a story in 4 sequels, all these, creating your own world creation myth, going into mythology. I see resonances of all this. Of course, there's obvious resonances in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, but really, I see it in video games. I see it in all these installations. And interestingly, we haven't really talked about the music yet. And so that's maybe not surprising, but worth mentioning that the sound of Wagner to me is so endlessly fascinating and has really shaped the sound of most epic movies, most most action movies, most video game music is shaped now that we are out of the 8-bit time, that we have the technological affordances. Again, technology is necessary. But now that we have that, the sound is Wagner. Modernized, of course, rendered in different ways, but the heavy brass for the hero scenes, the epic, lush, cosmic brand, a great spread of pitches at the beginning of the creation of the cosmos. Also the seamless use of the color palettes. Wagner went so far as to invent his own instruments when he realized he used instrumental colors like a painter would. And he used he thought, there's a gap on my palette. Like I don't have the color between pink and purple. And so he did two things to fill these gaps. He invented a new instrument, which to this day is called the Wagner tuba, which fills the gap between the French horns and the tuba, and there's different sizes of them. So now he has the seamless sound of brass. And that is the sound that we hear in all these epic movies and video games. But he also started to mix instruments in new ways. Adorno, the great philosopher Adorno, was the first to really insightfully comment on the sound, and he called it the mixed sound, the Mischklang, where he combines instruments that hadn't previously combined, so that the listener doesn't spot, this is the oboe, here the trumpet comes in, but the instruments blend. And so the seamless sound world of which we can avail ourselves on all the new Pro Tools, all the new technologies, again, that composers now have available. I think there's a very clear Wagnerian legacy here.
Wow. Yuval, anything you want to add on top of that?
So many great points there. It is not exactly an answer to your question, Arthur. I just want to maybe follow up on what Gundula was talking about in relation to the music, because this might be a source of where, to David's question about whether a tried and true Wagnerians, what they should expect from a production like this of Götterdämmerung, what they will not get is that Mischklang. They will not get the seamless array of brass. Again, it's partially, responding to the moment. We are not going to convene an orchestra of 70 plus to convey this piece. And actually the parking garage wouldn't really fit that group, that size group anyway. So actually these are all, the scenes that we're presenting are all arrangements, musical arrangements from The Ring. And they are pretty, let's just say, unusual. They are not just like the miniature. There is, the Waltraute scene is scored for solo cello, for example. The Alberich and Hagen scene is scored for accordion, electric bass, and bass clarinet. So we get this really unusual, I guess that is similar to what Gundula was talking about in terms of the unexpected combinations of instruments that does make Wagner so bewitching when you hear it, and so different, so alien sounding sometimes. So we get that. And then for the Rhine Maidens, for example, we have marimbas and xylophones to create this real kind of underwater-like feeling, So it's definitely an interpretation and a strong take on this music. But one of the things that I have found so powerful about having it done in this way is that we get closer to what Nietzsche said about Wagner, was that he was a great miniaturist. I think that's one of the things that we often forget about Wagner. We think about him in terms of the bombast, in terms of this epic, the epicness. But actually in the parking garage, when it's only 8 cars at a time and solo cello and Waltraute, you get so deep into the soul of this character in a way that I think is only possible in a theater like Bayreuth or some of the smaller European theaters, where everything really feels human scale. Actually, and much harder to achieve in America, where so many of the theaters are so much larger than life, 4,000 seats, everything needs to read just as well to the people all the way in the back as to the front row. So this sense of a real intimate connection between this group of audiences and the performers is something I'm very excited to share with this group. But I will also say, though, that thanks to the technology, it will be still a seamless experience as the audience moves from level to level. We have recorded a Detroit-based poet named Marcia Music to retell the story of The Ring in a kind of Detroit vernacular. And we hear that audio as we move from level to level so that we understand what it is that we're seeing in terms of the whole. And I'm very excited about incorporating this kind of spoken word, to add another layer of the Gesamtkunstwerk, adding this new kind of art form into this whole construction is something that I'm also very excited about. So just to respond to what the musical side of Twilight Gods is gonna feel like.
I was so fascinated, Yuval, in learning about how you're pulling off the music under these circumstances, especially, as I understand, having the music piped into the cars through an FM radio station. That's amazing. And it felt so Wagnerian to me, the idea that, because you're in your car and the music is coming through an FM radio station, there's that Wagnerian obfuscation of the source of these sounds that, inside of the theater, the orchestra is so low that you can't see where the music is coming from, but here you're in your car it's coming through an FM radio station. It's a sort of version of that Wagnerian concept. It's really, really amazing. Also, to me, the idea that you're sitting in your car, you're in this like air-conditioned space going through a parking garage, and you have this music piped in. To me, it felt, again, very Wagnerian, this idea that the music is this atmosphere that's sort of filtered into your car, and that you don't see where it's coming from. Again, like, you know, there's so many ways that you can't pull off like some of what seems so uniquely Wagnerian in terms of the bombast. But on the other hand, what you're doing is also so uniquely Wagnerian, even though it seems sort of like the opposite of what you'd expect. It's really brilliant. I love it. It's amazing.
Thank you so much.
I wonder about, if I could just pick up on Kirsten's point, I guess I wonder a little bit about the geographicization, if we can call it that, of the parking lot, right? Because of course, to my mind, you know, it sounds more like, you know, going, you know, if you're going in that circle either up or maybe even circling down, that sounds more like going to Nibelheim, right? Or, you know, going up across the bridge. I mean, you start to think of geographical gestures. Like, I absolutely agree with Kirsten that the sort of technology, the atomization of us in our bubble, in some sense, you know, captures part of the phantasmagoria of the disappearance of the orchestra. At the same time, Wagner has this fantasy and the creation of Bayreuth, right, without a center aisle, that creates this kind of whole audience that will, in some sense, in solidarity, experience this immersion in the work. That is contrary, I think, to the kind of the podding of us in our, you know, the 4 to 5 people or whatever in a car. Like, I think there's something brilliantly American about the idea that, you know, the means of production would be rendered invisible, but we in some sense would experience them in a kind of radical isolation. Anyway, just by way of quick comment.
Well, that's going to be, you know, what's really funny is because we're creating this project now, we're in the middle of rehearsals. Let's see, you know, let's see what that feels like. I really don't know until we do it. And I'm so excited to hear from audience members what they get. I will say that one of the things that excites me about this idea is that it does open it up to not feeling like, you know, sometimes the Wagnerian, you know, I'm a big Wagner lover, but for the critics of Wagner, for example, like my favorite critic of Wagner is Brecht, who would always say that, you know, like the Gesamtkunstwerk is an idea of a witch's brew in which the audience is kind of left hypnotized and numbed of its senses and numbed of its ability to think rationally and really process what they're seeing, but that they're just being a spell is cast on them, basically, and that the music creates that effect, the visual creates that effect. All of these things happen together, and I don't agree with that, but it brings up a point of critique that I think is really important as we do Wagner today. Is, you know, can we somehow have it both ways? You know, can we get the things that are great about Wagner and also have that kind of criticality that Brecht was so longing for? Because I actually think that's part of what Wagner was longing for too, is us looking at our own society critically. I mean, he speaks about that so often, to the points that all of you have made. So the notion that the audience for us is somewhat isolated. Of course, it's a part of the circumstances, but I also wonder about what that gives the audience in terms of that interpretational freedom that they have. You know, that we are not seated in unbroken rows, and we're not implying a sense of a homogenous kind of thought process for any one audience member. There's no laugh lines. There's no moment where this is where everyone's going to spontaneously applaud. If they do, they're only going to hear themselves, you know? So there is something, I hope, very empowering for each audience member to realize that they can grapple with this material all on their own. And I think with David, as you put it so beautifully, this kind of contradictory notion, all of the contradictory notions in Wagner, as opposed to making a claim for, I mean, I obviously lean more towards the radical side of Wagner than the reactionary side of Wagner, but nevertheless, to offer that all to an audience in the spirit of an isolation where they can choose and they can make a totality out of all of the impressions that they're going to get as they move through this parking garage, including all of the impressions that I will not be able to control. you know, the weather, the, you know, the different lighting per performance, you know, like there's a big openness to chance that this project allows for, which is something that I also think is a quite exciting turn of the screw for a notion of Gesamtkunstwerk, you know.
And if I can add to that, I think one brilliant thing here, this is a wonderful conversation. If we think of Nietzsche, who said Wagner is so oppressive, he like presses down on us and we can't escape and it's sickening. So the one possibility here is that the audience can turn off the radio. Like it's the first time that you can go to a Wagner opera and turn off the music. And of course, Adorno also talks about that, right? You can't close your ears. You can always close your eyes, but you can't close your ears. So I guess this is the first Wagner performance, live Wagner performance, where the audience can actually close their ears. So that's, I think, is a brilliant turn on that. And of course, the orchestration, I think, will also make it, as you said, sound new and be a commentary on what we've come used to associate with Wagner. So I think those combinations tease out some of the brilliant dialectics and issues here.
Okay, our next question deals with how does The Ring relate to audiences today? What does it still have to say to us about the current time and place, despite the characters and mythology of the story seeming so different? Do you want to start us out, Yuval?
Yeah, sure. Funny enough, you know, I had a different answer to this at the beginning of this conversation, and now also, you know, hearing from all three of you about the thing that is so endlessly fascinating about Wagner is the fact that he is kind of either or at the same exact time, that he is kind of, he's so many different perspectives simultaneously. And I think that there is something that I've grappled with a lot in terms of my love of Wagner and his terrible anti-Semitism, and trying to understand, you know, how to reconcile these two aspects of a great artist, who I think did fundamentally have a utopian vision for humanity, but then grappling with that shadow side and realizing that because we're human, we have both. You know, we have the heroic and we have the shadow in us at the same exact time. And I have to say that working with such complicated material right now gives me a real release for this kind of longing for more complexity and more ambiguity in our social discourse and our ability to communicate with each other, in which things can feel so polarizing all the time. And art really is this amazing source of ambiguous ideas, that it isn't clear cut, it isn't simple. That the great artist is also maybe a miserable human being in some respects. And having that together, I wonder what that does for each audience member being in that state of ambiguity and thinking more deeply about notions, not being so quick to cancel things just based on our instant reactions all the time, but to be in a state of pondering and thinking and seeing things from different perspectives simultaneously. And I do think that is something that Wagner, as polemical as he might seem, might really still offer us.
Interesting. Kirsten, do you want to weigh in on that?
I 100% agree. And something that came to mind for this question, though we've touched on it a bit already, is just the fact that we can really read The Ring as a kind of environmental parable. That's something we've talked about already. And that reading is really sort of part of this larger industrial critique that really essential to The Ring. And there's so many moments of like ecological death in The Ring that I think would seem familiar to audiences as part of the larger critique of like anthropogenic environmental chaos. And so I think that narrative would probably come through to audiences today. But one of the contradictions inherent in that narrative, so to say, well, humanity as a whole, if we want to, you know, be universalizing about it, can be responsible for this like really large scale and also small scale ecological disaster. But then Wagner, you know, speaking of the contradictions, is somebody whose Ring cycle is probably the most ecologically unfriendly opera, like set of operas. You know, it's like has the largest carbon footprint probably of like any set of operas. And, you know, it's unfair because it's a tetralogy, but like it's so environmentally unfriendly. But it's this tale that's about sort of, you know, reconnecting with nature and this return to nature. But, you know, in and of itself, it's not a good set of works to, you know, materially to do that. And that's something that I think might come through to audiences, possibly less so with this production, because it's, it doesn't require such large scale dramaturgy, but I think that the fact that you're in an industrial space.
David, did you want to add anything on top of that?
Happy to, and to get back to the formulation of the question, what does Wagner have to say to us in our current time and place? And then there's that qualifier, despite the characters and mythology of the story seeming so distant. I guess I'm not so sure that they feel so distant, at least to me. And maybe that's part of what I think Wagner has to say to us in our current time and place. I think, echoing something that Yuval observed, my sense is that that Wagner invites us to listen and engage and ponder, that he invites and sustains and rewards complexity, that he models complexity and at the same time solicits a complexity of engagement. And maybe another way of putting this is that my sense is that Wagner, on the one hand, he's a genius at giving us villains, of giving us villainy. But at the same time, I think I would say that he loves his villains. So Mime, if we think about Alberich or Mime or Klingsor in Parsifal, like, it strikes me that an artwork, that renders villainy, but invites us in some sense to understand villainy as complex, is so much more interesting than our contemporary political moment, which is a kind of Manichaean political landscape, right? In which you're either good or bad. You're either a villain, you're either in or out, you're either canceled or you're in, right? You're either with us or you're against us. And my sense with Wagner is that, it's so much more complicated than that. And any engagement with the work suggests to us, models for us a kind of engagement that is just so much more complicated. And I guess I find that really welcome at the present moment, a kind of alternative to the simple speak of thumbs up and thumbs down. So that by way of just a quick account of what Wagner has to say to us at the current moment and where we are.
Gundula?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Yuval, especially, and David said, the complexity in Wagner, and also completely agree with David that the characters, I think, are actually very highly relevant. And I mean, maybe it's not necessary to spell it out. But I think there's we have a leader here, Botan, who actually interestingly doesn't appear in Götterdämmerung anymore. But we get to see his outward, David mentioned it earlier, his corruption, right? He has a spear on which he engraves his contracts. We don't actually know how he became the godhead, but he's the leader, he's the chief god. And he has this spear taken from the world ash in which he engraves his contracts. And we learn that he never meant to keep the contracts. He's already intending the moment that he makes the contract to break the deal and kind of cheating his way along. And he's cheating in many ways, but he's cheating on women, he's using women, he's like, all those things. And at the same time, we get to see what Yuval called the shadow side, right? We get to see, but here in the sense shadow as in complexity. There's this outward surface of the great leader who has to be in charge and who has to have the power on all accounts and who cheats everybody else. But then we get this beautiful image of the inner turmoil that he has, especially I think in Valkyrie in the scene with Brunhilde, where we get really he is in conflict with himself, right? The ambiguity is deep inside himself. Hence, on the outside, he has all these big gestures and he's the powerful person, but inside we get this deeply feeling father, human being, who has got himself into a dead-end road and doesn't know how to get out, and in the end despairs. And I think that's something that's deeply, highly relevant, I think, for each one, but also on the bigger, larger political scale. And then I think Götterdämmerung is so beautiful because Yuval mentioned it. There's Brunhilde who awakens and who realizes, but it also gives us the story of courage, of self-sacrifice, of a cause larger than ourselves, for which we may have to sacrifice the ring, the potential to have our own power, the potential to have our own success or be right. Brunhilde doesn't go there and says, here, I was right and I'm paying it home, but she sacrifices all that for the bigger good. So in the end, I think there's also a story of hope. And with David, I hope I'm not delusional here, but to me, the end also musically speaks decidedly of hope for some change in society. So just my quick 2 cents here.
Well, my final question to each of you is, what personally brings you back to the study of Wagner and the Ring? Gundula, do you want to start off again for us?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we've said so many things here. It's the complexity. It's the fact that he speaks to so many of our concerns that are relevant today, and speaks to them on so complex ways using all these different media, so that wherever we look, I think there's something in Wagner that is helpful. And if we turn to Wagner, each situation we're in, I feel that I discover something new. I discover a new facet, I discover a new answer, I discover a new beauty in the music that gives me hope and that draws me back in the music and in the overall story and cosmos that he created. So there's a lot to say, but I think it's the richness of the sound, the richness of the story, the richness of his concept of the total work of art and of the immersion and what can be, ultimately a human edification that he was hoping for. So that does draw me back, despite all the problems.
How about it, David? What keeps you coming back?
So I remember when I was a kid and I would listen to oldsters and they would say, oh, I love, X, my wife, I love this art, because it's always new. And I would think, that's just so lame. And yet here I am finding myself saying that really, if I try to account for what keeps me coming back to Wagner, it's that, as Gundula was just saying, it's utterly paradoxical to me. I feel like I know this work really well, and yet every time I encounter it anew. How can that be? I mean, I think this is true of all great art, but it's certainly also true of Wagner, that I know this work, and yet I'm astonished repeatedly, differently. I'm astonished anew. And, that just seems like such an extraordinary gift to be able to have that experience.
Fabulous. Hey, Kirsten?
Yeah, I think to echo what David and Gundula already said, I think that when I first started becoming interested in Wagner when I was an undergraduate, I felt immediately as if whenever I came to Wagner, I found something new, and that it was like this series of endless discoveries that you can never know. It's impossible to have exhausted these works or exhausted Wagner, and that to me, I always felt like, I would spend some time with him and then suddenly something would reveal itself that I hadn't thought of and that didn't seem to even be possible. And it was like, you suddenly feel like you're grasping the hand of somebody 200 years ago that, and you're making this connection with this person. And it just felt like this process of endless discovery, which was always so exciting to me. And I still feel today like it's quite common for somebody to say, well, Wagner's been studied so much, and there's that adage, I think, that he's been written on as like more than any other historical figure besides like Jesus or something. There's something that people say like that, which is probably not true, but he's been written on so much that it's quite easy to think that it's enough already, but it's just impossible to exhaust it. And I think the contradictions, the complexities, the ways in which you're constantly finding ways that Wagner speaks to your current moment in ways that seem so contradictory on the face. And I think that it's impossible to exhaust Wagner. And I think that when I'm 90, I'll still think the same thing.
Oh, fantastic. Yuval, why you can't quit Wagner in the Ring?
I think I can't say it any better than Gundula, Kirsten, and David. I mean, it's truly an endlessly it really is a renewable resource. It's an endlessly renewable source of inspiration and commentary and criticism. And I just think that I am learning through this process of doing it in a way I never expected to do, that it's also so infinitely flexible, and that we're only just starting to understand the many different ways in which this work can be seen and experienced. And it's exciting for me to think about what this might lead to in terms of, taking a piece like this and really stripping it of all of the, all of the performance history of it, and putting it in a brand new site, recontextualizing it, translating it into English, new orchestration, really treating it as raw source material for a new piece to emerge. I think this is, I hope, just the beginning of an exploration that other artists will want to take.
I want to thank each one of you. You've given us the ability to continue, us, the audience, to find the resonance and the relevance of this epic work. Thank you so much for being here. It was really a pleasure to speak with all of you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you
so much.